You know, it's occurred to me. If Red Bull gives you wings, do we really want to see a flying Sasquatch? Inquiring minds want to know. What are the humans doing?
Do you think you're ready? Can you handle the truth? Or are you in denial and demanding more proof? They demonstrate in real time how they're spinning you lies, but no one pays attention, no one opens their eyes. They walk around like zombies with their head in the mobiles, signaling their virtues with a pick on their profile. Yeah. Signaling their virtues with a pick on their profile. So if you think you're ready, you don't need more proof. Conspiracy deniers are denying the truth. They fabricate our problems and pretend to provide the best solution, but we all know they lie. They lied about the weapons and they lied about health. They lied about the fact that they're transferring the wealth. You should really notice how they're pushing the fear. Keep everybody terrified and not thinking clear. Yeah. Everybody's not thinking clear. Keep everybody terrified. Yeah, and nothing. Keep everybody terrified and not thinking clear. When you do, you realize that this is the trick. It's getting really stupid now. They're taking the mic. Said, do you think you're ready? Can you handle the truth? Or are you in denial and demanding more proof? They demonstrate in real time how they're spelling you lies. But no one pays attention, no one opens their eyes. They walk around like zombies with their head in the mobiles, signaling their virtues with a pick on their profile. Yeah. Signaling their virtues on their profile. Hey.
One is still far, far more than none when it comes to eyeballs, my brother. What's up, Blue Unicorn? Matthew the King. Good to see both of y'all. Sterling, welcome in. I know it's been a minute, but I've been doing things. I've been talking to folks and trying to set some stuff up, and we will see how all that works out in the future. How are we doing this evening, ladies and gentlemen? Are we alive? Did we survive? Who we got? We got Data's all back. Mandatory carry gets the gold. Workline gets the silver, although he has not showed up on YouTube yet. I don't know why. Probably because of what he typed. But yeah, lots of loves up in here. We'll show everybody anyway because we have the power. Unlimited power. Right? Oh, we have it. ATL gets the bronze. Welcome to the show, bud. Good to see you. Over to everybody else who's chatted so far. All right, so y'all know how this goes. I got a little bit from a buddy of mine named Captain Curmudgeon. We do because of the dulcet tones that I just can't resist. He's such a specimen of a true man. I mean, when it comes to making an ass of yourself on the internet, he's America's ass. Hey, Heather, welcome to the show, bud.
Meaningful length of time, and you have a
New York Outcast, good to see you, bud.
You don't need me to tell you that every 15 years or so, just about like clockwork, there occurs some serendipitous confluence of bad government policy, corporate greed, and generalized incompetence. that causes the bottom to fall out of our entire national economy. And would you look at that? It's been exactly 15 years since the start of the Great Recession, so you know what time it is now. And you're especially excited today if you're one of those people who has spent the last decade and a half trying to dig yourself out of the last hole they put you into. For there is a not insignificant chance that you are about to experience, once again, the unvarnished joy of losing every single thing you've earned and worked for through absolutely no fault of your own. So is there an overarching moral that we can glean from
Hello,
the fact
Brandy.
that we
Welcome to
keep
the show, babe.
experiencing the same scenario over and over again at exactly the same intervals, despite the assurances of our government officials and our captains of industry that they're never,
Ever.
going to let anything like this happen again?
Nope. Never
Well,
happened.
yes, there is. And
Do
the
not
moral is
believe
this:
your lying
our
eyes.
leaders are stupid, corrupt people who can't tell their asses from a hole in the ground. And our leaders will continue being stupid and corrupt for as long as we, the people who choose them, insist on sticking with the same two ossified, institutionalized political factions that we had in 1870. The Great Recession, of course, was authored by a Republican administration. They decided it would be a splendid idea to massively expand the federal government, launch 2 open-ended blank check foreign military adventures, and then do a
Thank
whole
you,
bunch of
Heather.
tax
I was
cuts.
just fixing to start doing that.
George W. Bush remains the only leader in world history who ever cut taxes while
See if I can
fighting
make
2
this happen.
foreign wars. And as we know all too well, his administration did next to nothing to stop the mortgage-backed security bubble from building and then bursting in catastrophic fashion. Because it's 2004, baby. We got ourselves an election to win here. And the way we win it is by saying, oh, look here, we have got the highest home ownership rate in history. This economy is going gangbusters, and it's never
Hey, sewer
going to
dog.
end.
Dude,
Plus,
I haven't seen you in a minute. I was starting to worry about you, actually. It's good to see you, man. I appreciate you coming by and letting me know you're still alive, because I've seen you on a couple of chats, but it was like 2 or 3 months ago, and I haven't seen you since. I was worried you may have sprung forth from this mortal coil. It was upsetting me in my deep, dark hours and shower thoughts, you know. You know.
I'm the guy who cut your taxes. And the voters chose to believe it. Bush won the election by a fairly wide margin. And then his administration managed to paper over the cracks in the economy for another 2.5 years or so until the dam finally, inevitably burst. This time around, it's different, but still the same. When we started forcing people to stay home at gunpoint, when we artificially stopped the whole economy in its tracks over a stupid Chinese flu virus and started shotgun blasting trillions of dollars of fake money into the system. And that happened under Trump. This isn't just a Biden thing. It became a foregone conclusion that we eventually would reach the point where banks would start failing. Because you simply cannot engage in that kind of reckless monetary policy without your country and its people paying a heavy price for it. And the price gets heavier when you decide at the same time to throw open the border and import another 5 million or so unproductive mouths to feed. And it gets steeper still when you also decide to spend $90-odd billion
Hey,
fighting a
Indoctrinated.
proxy war with
Welcome to the
Russia.
show, bud. Good to see you.
But then that's another fun feature of these periodic collapses, isn't it? People like you and me are the ones who get cleaned out and lose everything we've got. While people like Joe Biden don't lose a damn thing, and they laugh all the way to the Caymans. Do the failed banks themselves own some share of the culpability? Well, of course they do. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, it's probably not a coincidence that the wokest banks are failing the first and failing the hardest, because financial
Hey, Strictly
institutions
Strange. Good to see you,
typically
bud.
do not prosper when they prioritize.
I saw you
woke
last night, too,
virtue
but I was
signaling,
kinda having my
personal
hands full of
pronoun
Watch
seminars
Watch.
and cringe-inducing music videos over the things that banks traditionally prioritize, like being able to cover their customers' deposits. And 15 years from today, when we're in the late 2030s, if we're still beating our heads against the damn wall by continuing to elect Democrats and Republicans exclusively, then we can look forward to doing this all over again for the 4th time in the lives of most of us. Or else we, all of us, liberal, conservative, indifferent alike, can start recognizing the fact that we need to arrange better representation for ourselves. What a concept, right? If the people you choose to represent you keep screwing the pooch over and over and over again for decades on end in exactly the same way, You can choose different representatives. What a revolutionary idea.
All right, Dragonette. The poll question has to do with whether or not I'm drinking. I don't know if y'all are answering whether or not y'all are drinking, but 38% are actually currently no, I don't want to end it. I just want to see it. Let me see it. 38% of you said, "Are you drinking?" I guess that's a question. But yeah, no, the ability to see is far and above more important than in an environment where not seeing is the standard. The ability to see is like a superpower. These people have only heard their world, and you can see it. Although, admittedly, once you get off into the caves, it becomes a different equation. But still, I think it's a valid point. All right, so what would you do if you were the only woman stranded? If you were the only woman stranded on a deserted island with 32 men, would you A, take over and rule it with an iron fist, B, probably be utilized as some form of chattel arrangement in the group, or C, just fold under and do whatever you're told? Hey, Izzy Pop. I'll give you one good one. Let's see. I don't know how my man do it, but 32 of the opposite gender, the only woman and 32 men. What do you reckon happens? Does it turn into an absolute free for all? Do all the men just kill each other over the woman? Are we talking about trading things for things? If you catch my drift. And I'm giving you a tip. If you're ever involved with any of those unsavory ladies of the night, never ever pay them. Always give them a birthday card. There's nothing illegal about giving somebody a birthday card. I don't care how much money there is in it.
In 1994, a group of 33 people, 32 men and 1 woman, were stranded on a small island in the Pacific Ocean, far away from any major landmass. Because this was a period of chaos immediately following the end of the Second World War, they were virtually disregarded and left to survive on their own for the next several years. By the time they were rescued in 1951, only 20 of the 32 men were left.
That's my girl.
The other 12 had either been killed or gone missing, presumably due to fighting over the lone woman of the group. This is the story of the Queen of Anatahan. Before we get into the story, if you would like to see more content covering incidents and events in a documentary format,
by all means,
please
man,
like,
check this dude
subscribe,
out.
and turn on notifications so you don't miss my future uploads.
Arg. All right, so earlier my computer completely flatlined mid freaking stream. I was like, in fact, I tried to send Samuel the Infamous an email, and it flatlined when I sent the email, and I had to go in and redo it with my phone because it did not send. I didn't figure that out till like a few minutes ago, but so it probably won't be showing up. But this dude's stuff is well thought out, well written. I haven't been able to punch any major holes in the little bit of stuff. Hey, Biggie and Bing, welcome to the show, darling. I haven't been able to punch any holes from my basic memory of having read about this, because it's a very interesting concept. The idea of a single woman on an island, covered men. I mean, it could get nasty, supposedly. I mean, let's see. Let me get this man's link up. Hold up. I got to do things right. All professional like professionals. No. And by the way, the drinking doesn't start until after I go off live. We're no longer drinking. We're no longer doing darn it function. I'm telling you, this computer's fixing to melt down. Like any day now, I'm going to come in here and it's just going to be a blue smoke ring. Skadoosh. All right. This is my homie right here. Where'd he go? There he is. I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes. Y'all should go check out some of Biggie and Bean's stuff. She's got these wonderful little stained glass videos that are just I don't know, it rubs my autism the right way. I don't know how to explain it. It's sort of an odd ASMR thing.
In the Pacific Ocean, to the south of Japan, there are the Mariana Islands, a string of islands which is now administered by the United States of America. One of these islands is called Anatahan, which is where our story takes place. During the period between the First and Second World Wars, the Mariana Islands were under Japanese control, and a company called Nanyo Kohatsu, which roughly translates into South Sea Development Company, was conducting agricultural development in this area. The South Sea Development Company had a plantation on Anatahan, operated by the plantation manager, Kikuichiro, his subordinate, and the subordinate's wife, Kazuko, as well as a few dozen staff of local residents. As Japan began losing ground to the Allies, the war would eventually reach Anatahan. And one day in 1944, a group of 31 sailors drifted onto the island after their ship had been badly damaged in combat. The sailors were all young men, ranging from their late teens to early 20s. At the time, Kazuko's husband was off to another island to run an errand, and could not come back to Anatahan due to heavy military activity in the area. Fearing what the young men might do to her on this lawless island, Kikuichiro would pretend to be Kazuko's husband, assuming that the sailors would not do anything towards a presumably married couple.
Oh yeah, Biggie.
And so Kazuko, Kikuichiro, and the 32 sailors, along with a handful of local islanders, began their castaway survival life on this tiny speck of land in the Pacific. Luckily, this island had rich soil, so they would grow potatoes, catch fish, and occasionally eat rats and lizards that lived on the island. They would even make a kind of alcohol from the palm trees. For the time being, they had more than enough to survive. In the summer of 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allies, and the Americans.
And then they found a woman. Dun, dun, dun. And it was like discovering the atom bomb. It just laid waste to the country. I don't know. I haven't watched all of it. I just watched enough of it to verify that he does good work. Oh, cool, bud. Oh, wait, I missed it. Y'all are moving far too fast for me. You know, much love. It's the way we do it. It's the only way this stuff works. You kind of got to work at it. That was kind of part of the reason why I've taken 2 steps back and didn't know what to think about the situation, because we got a new homie in charge up there at the top. His interpretation of things seemed to be a little different from Susan's. So everything you've learned up to this point was just a training ground for you to figure out how to do it now. Welcome to YouTube. First they ate snakes, then they found a woman. What the hell kind of shit is going on about chat? What? All right, no.
Americans would occasionally visit this island, announcing over loudspeakers that the war was over, and whoever was left on the island should surrender themselves. The local islanders were quick to board the American ships and leave the island, but Kikuichiro, Kazuko, and the sailors were reluctant to do so. Partly because they believed the Americans would kill them if they gave themselves up, and partly because they didn't want to believe Japan had lost the war. They had enough resources to sustain life on this island and decided to continue their survival life on Anatahan. Initially, Kazuko and Kikuichiro lived separately from the sailors, only interacting with them when necessary. But things would change in the summer of 1946, when one of the sailors stumbled upon the remains of a B-29 bomber, which had presumably crashed on the island during the war. He would find a pistol on the corpse of the pilot, and this would disturb the delicate balance of power. The sailor who found the pistol used it to threaten Kikuichiro, demanding to have Kazuko for himself. Kikuichiro had no choice but to give in, and the sailor would now become Kazuko's second husband. However, this second husband would soon be found dead.
What's up, Topher?
The reason of his death would differ depending on who you would ask. Kazuko would later claim he fell off a cliff, while some of the sailors
Yeah.
claimed the second husband was killed.
He fell off a cliff, all right. That's absolutely certain. How he fell off that cliff might be in doubt. Because let me tell you something. The only woman on the island, and now there's a gun. Times are changing. What's up, Crypto Alchemist? Good to see you, bud. Yeah, hit that like button or don't, or I don't know, share it. Sharing is a superpower on YouTube. It's something that they gave everybody with the community tab, and now anybody can do it. So there's not even really much impetus to make you want to, create content. I mean, there's no thresholds or anything. It's just monetized or non-monetized, and that's it. So, like, I know I could do a much cooler show by using copyrighted material, but at the same time, it's kind of a gauge of your skill of what you're doing, I don't know. Maybe I'm just nuts. Sometimes I'm just nuts. Y'all go check out Toe for Life. He's got another channel. I can't remember the name of the other one. It's like Wiring for Life or something like that. Can't remember. What's the name of your other channel, bud? We're going to end that poll. I might get another poll to dance on here in a little bit. We'll see.
Killed by Kikuichiro.
Oh, here's the poll. I got a poll.
Not long after the death of the second husband, Kikuichiro himself would also be found dead, due to causes unknown. Kazuko initially claimed that he died because of food poisoning after he ate a raw crab, but would later change her claim to say that Kikuichiro was killed by the man who would later become her third husband. This third husband would also be murdered by a man who would then become her fourth husband. Around this time, there would also be rumors going around that Kazuko was sleeping with men other than her pseudo-husbands, and that this was causing strife within the sailors.
What's up, John Denicola? Good
They
to
would
see you,
start
bud.
blaming
Gypsy
Kazuko
Auditor.
as the root cause of the
Welcome to the show.
deaths and
Good to see you.
overall infighting among the group. Kazuko, fearing that the men might turn against her, decides that it would be safer to give herself up to the Americans. So she hid from the men in the jungle for about a month, waiting for a ship to come by.
All right, so all the propaganda, pre-war propaganda from the Japanese side of all of this depicted the American soldier as a ravenous savage, foaming at the mouth that would devour anything in its path, that it was eating the Pacific, which is why they had to stand against it. But this chick on an island of 32 men who essentially are passing her around like a stogie, she decided that she would rather go with the feral Americans than stay on this freaking island. And I think that was the best decision she ever made. I think it was a good one. It's a good solid future decision for her life. Absolutely.
By the island again. In 1950, she succeeded in escaping the island on an American ship and was taken back to Japan. 1 year later, in the summer of 1951, the sailors remaining on the island were also rescued and brought back to Japan. However, it turned out that only 20 men were still alive. There were 32 men to begin with, and as far as we know, Kikuichiro and Kazuko's second and third husband had died.
Out there. Who cares?
So there should be 29 remaining. What happened to the other 9? The simple answer is we just don't know for sure. Kazuko would change her story multiple times, and her claims were inconsistent with what the sailors had to say, as I will describe in detail later. After returning to Japan, Kazuko finds out her real husband was alive, but had married another woman, assuming Kazuko had died in the chaos during and after the war. Kazuko couldn't go back to her husband, so she needed a way to make a living on her own. She would attempt to do this through the media, as various media companies were more than happy to interview her. Kazuko would appear on various newspapers and magazines, and the story of a lone woman who survived on an island with a few dozen men spread like wildfire, making her somewhat of a celebrity. She would often talk about how she had relationships with many men, and how they would fight and even kill each other over her. It is up for debate on whether these claims were true, or if she intentionally exaggerated the story for publicity. The perception of the public was generally positive, seeing Kazuko as a strong woman who survived on an island surrounded by men, and would be.
This is strong and independent women. Is that what we're saying? profile of a true suffragette. Okay, so here's my question. Let's say there wasn't a woman on that island at all, hypothetically, but there was a transgender guy. Let's say you're one of these 32 men, and there's this one dude on the island that's very friendly with pretty much anybody that comes along, given the circumstances. But how long do you reckon it take you to decide that maybe it is a woman? Just curious.
Begin referring to her as the Queen of Anatahan. A theater play would be created based on the story of the Queen of Anatahan, and Kazuko actually starred in it, playing herself. She would spend 2 years touring Japan, taking to the stage in various theaters.
I got to be honest, man. It's going to take me a little while. I mean, I'm going to have to be on that island alone with those guys for like 2, maybe 4 hours before I start having thoughts like that.
She even had a full-length movie made on her, which she again played herself as the main character. There was also a Hollywood movie made after her story, but she did not participate in it.
Mouse, what's up, man?
Unfortunately for Kazuko, the reviews for her shows and movie were horrible, mainly due to her poor acting skills. Around this time, some of the sailors would publish their own books, giving their side of the story regarding the Queen of Anatahan.
Wait a second, let me get this straight. My girl came back from the island filled with men, being the only woman there, volunteered to go on a ship full of sailors, being the only woman there. And then once she got here, she decided to star in films and starred in her own film about herself, where she played herself badly. How do you play yourself badly? And also, given the circumstances, shouldn't that be some like serious Pornhub type action? I mean, like, I'm pretty sure I've seen this same plot play out before somewhere. What's up, make stupid people famous? I agree with that sentiment 100%. Let's give you a little post up on the wall of shame up there. Skadoosh. Unlimited power, right?
One of the sailors would claim Kazuko would seduce the men to give her food, clothing, and other resources, as well as manipulate the men into fighting each other. He claimed at least 9 men died as a direct result of this infighting.
That's true. That's true. Elvis did take second place in an Elvis impersonation contest, and that's an interesting point. There is this Count Dankula covered this story really well. He did a really in-depth coverage, although there's some parts of it he couldn't cover because YouTube, you know. There was a German soldier who took everybody's amphetamine tablets and went on a meth-fueled rampage across the Swedish countryside for like 12, 14 days. He got blowed up, attacked by a badger, fought some trees, beat up at least a couple of Swedish soldiers or possibly a farmer, maybe a little girl. We're not really sure exactly what happened. But when a few years after the war, there was a local competition somewhere, wherever he was living, where they wanted to get a true life account of something amazing that happened in the war. He wrote his story and came in second. Right? Is that what it's called? Third Reich Berserker? But yeah, no, dude, the actual story he wrote is way more unbelievable than the way Count Dankula depicts it. He keeps saying there's stuff I can't tell you about because he would go on these weird hallucination infused just rants in the book. Like he randomly just starts talking about something that happened when he was a kid that would flash in front of him while he was skiing across the freaking alpine tundra on way more meth than anyone's ever survived before.
Kazuko's poor performance on stage, combined with the accusations from the sailors, tainted her reputation. And her public image would turn from a brave survivor into a wicked woman who manipulated men to do her bidding.
No, don't do that.
She would begin backpedaling on her claims of having relationships with many men, saying she had no choice. She had to get close to some men to survive, and that only 2 men had died fighting over her. The others had passed away from starvation, food poisoning, and other random accidents, such as falling off a cliff. But the damage had been done, and people would begin harassing her when they saw her in town. She no longer got offers for media appearances, and could not get a job due to her tainted image. Kazuko would move to the countryside to avoid attention, and over time the media craze surrounding the Queen of Anatahan faded away. Not much is known about what happened to Kazuko afterward, but she would eventually get married and run a small restaurant in the countryside. Kazuko passed away due to a brain tumor in 1971, at 51 years of age. Was the Queen of Anatahan really a wicked woman who manipulated and indirectly killed multiple men to satisfy her personal greed and pleasure? Or was she just the victim of circumstance, doing what she had to do to protect herself, stranded on an island in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by men? There was a movie released in 2010, loosely based on the story of Kazuko. But few people remember the real story that inspired the movie. The story of the Queen of Anatahan has mostly faded away from the memory of Japanese people. It has been over 70 years since the survivors came back to Japan. The youngest of them would be in his 90s by now. If some are still alive, they are probably the only people who know what really happened on the island of Anatahan. Thank you for watching until the end. Please like, subscribe, and turn on
Absolutely. You do all those things immediately. Where's it at? Yeah, screw it. We'll let it play out.
notifications so you don't miss my next video.
Don't miss nothing. Ever.
I'll see you next time.
Be like me. Lurk everywhere all the time. Come on, function. You're supposed to do this automatically.
Most people imagine
There we go.
life on a
All right.
tropical island.
All right. So let's reverse the circumstance. Let's say you're the only man on an island of women. And what happens then? Yeah, your financial situation can definitely put a speed bump in your plans to do things. This is true. That's where I've been for the past month or two. Do I fix my truck? Do I just trade it in? Do I fix it then trade it in? Does any of this make any sense? Does any of it actually matter? No, none of it actually matters, because what we're going to do is we're going to take it up there and get rid of the freaking truck, because that damn thing's a freaking nest of vipers, and just get a van and worry about the rest of it later, because it is not my concern. All right, so we are going to drop homie's link over here. The name of the channel is Incredible Stories, and honestly, fairly happy with it. I've watched a couple of his things, and they're not quite as ASMR-ish as the last guy, but they're fairly thorough. Right? Absolutely.
As something magical. Clean sandy beaches, palm trees, warm ocean, beautiful women, and no worries whatsoever. Something along the lines of the famous Bounty ad. However, the realities of island life can be much more prosaic than one's most pessimistic ideas. The story of Pitcairn Island is the best proof of that. For over 2 centuries, the island had been witness to all the harsh realities of the difficult life on a 4.5 square kilometers piece of land lost in the Pacific Ocean. Pitcairn Island is the state with the smallest population in the world. With only 49 people living there, Pitcairn has a surprisingly fascinating story. It was founded by bounty mutineers who fled from English justice, after which the island was ruled by alcoholics and experienced a terrible genocide. Eventually, only one man was left alive. Later, this microstate was governed by a succession of crooks and lunatics, and in 2004, it became famous as the country with the highest percentage of pedophiles and ex-cons in the world.
But wait a second. It's got one of the lowest populations in the world of like, what, 200-300 people? So like, one would be a lot. 3 would be like a huge lot. Crazy.
Some 50 residents, but so many events. Polynesians used to live there, but they died out without the help of Europeans. Polynesians,
Hard pass
most
on
likely
that one.
Tahitians, settled on Pitcairn back in the 11th century. They founded a settlement there, brought over domestic animals, and lived an overall good life. Pitcairn Island had reserves of quality stone and obsidian, so the first inhabitants of the island lived by trading with the people of Mangareva Island, located 500 kilometers away.
Oh, well,
They might have
dude,
sworn allegiance
a non-mouse. The Red Bulls are for me, not for you. And every time I've ever had anything to do with Coke, it gave me an explosive headache. Like I'd literally stand up and be like, well, I'm done, and go to bed because my head hurts so bad. So I just don't. I mean, I just don't.
to the king of Mangareva. The happy life of the Polynesians lasted 400 years. But then, the reserves of obsidian ran out, and a civil war broke out on Mangareva. Without trade, Pitcairn Islanders languished and eventually died out altogether. When the first Europeans arrived, there were no Polynesians living on the island. The story of Pitcairn Island started with the mutiny on the Bounty. The island story is one of the rebellious sailors and their descendants. In 1787, Britain sent the Bounty out into the Pacific Ocean with the mission to find the breadfruit tree. The British had recently lost the American colonies, so they were panicking. They still had important colonies in the Caribbean, but a riot could break out there at any moment, all because of hunger. The local soil wasn't suitable for cultures that the Europeans were familiar with, so the British decided to plant a breadfruit tree in the West Indies. It was for this purpose that they sent the Bounty to the Pacific Islands. But the mission failed. Captain Bligh brought the ship to the shores of Tahiti, where life was too good to be true. The sailors were welcomed with open arms, and the local women turned out to be very loving. Thus, the crew of the ship lived there for over 6 months, and they were very reluctant to return to the sea. The mutiny followed.
I could see how that might become a problem, right? You turn a bunch of men loose on an island primarily of women, and the women are like, hell yeah, we got some men's. There wasn't enough men's, now there's enough men's. Whose man's is this? Does it matter? We don't care. They're leaving soon anyway, right? So we'll just frolic and have us a good time. Have us a bunch of babies when they leave, and nobody's none the caring, right? Doesn't matter. However, if they decide to stick around, this becomes an issue. Guaranteed.
Followed shortly thereafter. On April 28, 1789, the sailors set Bligh and his supporters adrift on a fragile boat in the middle of the ocean, while they returned to Tahiti. A while later, it began to dawn on some of the sailors that retribution would inevitably follow their rebellion. They boarded the Bounty and sailed away, having decided to try and settle on the uninhabited Pitcairn Island. They were led by Fletcher Christian. Actually, it was the same man who initiated the mutiny against Bligh. The rest of the sailors remained on Tahiti and paid for it. The British eventually got them. Some of them were hanged, while others were sentenced to hard labor. But Christian's crew managed to escape. However, their life on Pitcairn Island wasn't nearly as heavenly as on Tahiti. The worst event in the history of Pitcairn was the invention of moonshine. Pitcairn Island was inhabited in 1790.
All right, so this story has a spot dear to my heart because this is something that my family's seen play out a few times in history. And it doesn't have to be an island. It can happen on a street or a street corner or a block. This issue can completely destroy a local environment if handled inappropriately. And this gentleman in here handled it inappropriately.
By 9 European sailors, including Christian, 6 Lower Castle Tahitians, who were virtually slaves, and 12 Tahitian women. What's interesting is that each of the Europeans got a woman, but the 6 slaves got only 3. As you could see, The seeds of discord were planted long before the colony was founded. Like the Polynesians in the 11th century, the new settlers appreciated Pitcairn Island. There were a lot of fertile lands, fresh water, and a heavenly climate. The main problem turned out to be alcohol. One of the sailors, McCoy, learned how to make moonshine from the sweet roots of the Thai plant growing there. It was a truly diabolical invention that led to genocide. The crew of the Bounty drank violently. Christian stepped back from leadership and got very depressed. McCoy, the owner of the moonshine still, took over governing the island. He turned out to be the worst kind of autocrat, a drunken tyrant and a mediocre leader. Once, he sent one of the women fishing, a beautiful woman named Tebarua, and when she didn't catch enough fish, he bit off her ear in a drunken rage.
Maybe it's related
The
to
woman
Tyson.
committed suicide by jumping off a cliff, and McCoy
Man,
went to his
let me tell you
slaves
something
for
about
a new
these small Pacific islands over here. These cliffs, they are dangerous. Y'all got to be careful near them cliffs, man. Everybody I hear of falling off of them.
woman, as if nothing had happened. The attempt to take one of the 3 wives from 6 already angry men turned into a massacre. The Tahitian men decided to exterminate the Europeans. They came up with a smart plan. They stole the muskets and other weapons from McCoy and his crew and tracked the sailors down one by one. In just
That's how you
a
do
few hours, they managed to kill most of the Europeans, mainly by decapitating them. The only 4 men left
Hey,
were
Cat,
Adams,
welcome to the
Young,
show.
Quintal, and ironically, McCoy, who started the whole mess. The terrible massacre on Pitcairn Island eventually resulted in the fact that only 1 man survived. So the year was 1793. Tebarua had committed suicide
Hold
because
up. All right, y'all start talking about jerky shine. Okay, so going down, I bet it ain't too terrible bad, but I guarantee you your stomach's not going to appreciate that smoke flavor, and that meat flavor is not supposed to be in alcohol at all. It's going to reject it. And can you imagine what it's like the other way?
McCoy bit off her ear, and the rebels killed 5 of the 9 Bounty sailors. But that was only the beginning. That same night, the Tahitian women killed all the Tahitian men in their sleep. The remaining European men were a bit out of it after these events. Young and Adams started praying fervently and studying the Bible for days on end. Quintal drank
Hey,
himself
Russell
into
Sperry, welcome to
oblivion
the show, bud.
and
Good to
turned
see
into
you.
a maniac who tried to kill the Pitcairn children, and there were many of them already. The remaining men decided that they couldn't allow infanticide to happen, so they beat Quintal to death.
All right, so I don't know if this was a gag gift or what, but when I was about 16 or so, we went and spent 2 or 3 months in various mountain cabins up in North Georgia and Kentucky and stuff like that. And one of these tiny little country stores in one of these little hollers up there was a bottle, and I have no idea if this is a legitimate thing, but there was a bottle of bacon tequila. And I remember seeing it and thinking, that can't be a real thing. No one would want to drink bacon tequila, but it was right there on the shelf. Beer is your favorite fruit.
After that, McCoy went to a rock by the sea and hanged himself. Yang also died soon, either from shock or because of an asthma attack. Adams was the only man left on the island. He reluctantly took on the role of the patriarch of Pitcairn, although initially he wasn't a very strong-willed man and was relatively young. The history of Pitcairn had more rogue dictators than other empires. Given the story of how it was inhabited, it isn't surprising that all kinds of crooks ruled Pitcairn most.
All right. So I'll admit that doesn't sound horrendous. What's up, John Smith? Welcome to the show, bud. Bacon, jalapeno, vodka, Bloody Marys. but with bacon tequila. I don't know, dude. I don't know. I couldn't believe it. I could not buy that was an actual thing that somebody would put in their mouth voluntarily. But then again,
most of the time. First, there was Christian, who became a drunk, fell into depression, and ignored his duties. Then McCoy, who ruled the island like a true bootlegger. Then was the cartel of 4 men, one of whom hanged himself, while another one got beaten to death. Well, Adams turned out to be a rather...
But why? Why is it real? Why? For what purpose could it possibly serve to have bacon in your tequila? It does not compute, man. I'm in the South, bro. We barbecue everything. If you could barbecue a tequila, we would barbecue a tequila. But I don't know. I don't see it. I just don't see it. Can you imagine it coming back up? I guess you don't shoot shots of it. It's for mixed drinks. Like what? I don't know. Fucking salad? I don't know. What the fuck do you put bacon tequila on? I can't.
Rather controversial man, too. There's an opinion that Young didn't die a natural death, but that Adams killed him. And then, having gotten all this new responsibility and having read the Bible, he decided to become a kind of theocratic leader. Adams imagined himself to be Adam, surrounded by Eves, and Pitcairn Island as a paradise that the sinful humans had almost lost. The following decades were spent attempting to create an ideal Christian society. The Pitcairn Patriarch read the scriptures to his parish, conducted rituals in his own way, strictly followed morality, broke the moonshine still, and produced a bunch of children. Half of
That's
all
cool,
the
Samuel.
people on the
No,
island.
Listen, I tried to send that email like 8 hours ago when I set up the stream, but for some reason it managed to set the stream up but didn't send the email when my computer crashed, and I didn't realize it till like 20 minutes before the show, and I was like, well, shit, I don't know, that thing might show up over there in a week. Maybe I should send another one just to make sure it's like there, because it would look real, because you know how Google is sometimes, man. Stuff don't work right. Be 2 weeks later, you'll get a message saying, homie sent a message 2 weeks ago and you never responded, but I never got it. It never showed up in my list. How can I respond to a message Google didn't show me? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, that's fine, dude. Do your work thing. That's fine.
Were his direct descendants. In 1808, when British ships sailed to the shores of Pitcairn Island, they found a pastoral religious community headed by a handsome gray-haired guru. The British liked this picture so much that they started to view Pitcairn Island as an island of virtue and the embodiment of Victorian morality. After Adams's death, the native Pitcairn residents often fell under the influence of various crooks. One day, adventurer George Nobbs sailed there and quickly became the leader of the community. He was a veteran of the war in Chile and a rather charismatic man, although not without quirks. Later, the island fell into the hands of Joshua Hill, who claimed to have been sent by the crown and appointed governor of the island. Hill expelled Nobbs and anyone who dared to doubt his regalia, built himself a palace, which actually looked more like a barn, demanded respect, and overall behaved as if he were the king of Britain.
So basically, he just thugged out. He like showed up, looked around, and said, "These punks ain't serious." It was serious. Gotcha.
Then, the deceit was revealed, and the usurper was expelled in disgrace. This didn't stop Pitcairn Island from immediately falling under the spell of a new adventurer, John Tay, a
Let's be honest. If I didn't have technical issues, I probably wouldn't have any issues. So, I mean, my computer being glitchy is par for the course. This is the same computer I've been dealing with for the past year, and it just does this trash. Chances are it'll run through this whole stream, never even hiccup, but it may flatline in the next 10 seconds, and there ain't a damn thing I can say or do to change it. Sometimes I'll be sitting here playing the game and I'll reach over and mute my mic or unmute my mic, and I'll hit it with a static shock and it'll flatline the computer. That can't be good for it.
Seventh-day Adventists, who baptized the population of the island into his faith. Tay lied to the locals that Adventism had already been accepted in England, arguing that the residents of Pitcairn Island needed to be good citizens and join that church. The islanders weren't particularly affected by this, but Tay became the leader of the community for some time and ordered the extermination of all pigs, as was required by his faith. They felt sorry for the pigs, but since Victoria herself had accepted Adventism,
I
nothing
get
could be-
that. I get that, because multiple subscriptions means lots and lots of issues. like somebody got a hold to your to your address and ordered you a bunch of magazines that you don't want. Lots of issues. I get it.
be done. The inhabitants of Pitcairn Island are still followers of this religion.
What's up, D.
Despite the
Johns?
fact that in the
Welcome back. Good
19th
to see
and
you, bud.
20th centuries, Pitcairn Island was called the bastion of Victorian morality in the Pacific Ocean, or maybe because of this, the state has an outrageous percentage of pedophiles. But that's not as hard to achieve, actually. With a population of 50 people,
Right.
one pedophile is enough to rank first in the world, statistically speaking. However, there were 8 of them. In 2004, 7 Pitcairn residents were convicted of sex with minors, rape, and child abuse.
And in 2004, 7 Pitcairn residents were found strung up at the end of the church, and there were no more problems on the island.
Among them was the mayor of Pitcairn
Hey, Michael,
Island,
welcome to the
Steve
show, bud.
Christian,
Good to see you.
a descendant of the Fletcher Christian, who started the mutiny on the Bounty. In 2006, they were convicted and put behind bars. For this particular reason, a prison had to be built on the island. In 2010, they were released, but another one was caught immediately thereafter. The new mayor, Mike Warren. He got caught with a 15-year-old girl who was actually a police officer. Now they prefer not to mention these criminal cases.
Hold on. They have 15-year-old. Okay. So they have so much of a problem that they're hiring 15-year-olds, or was it a police officer pretending to be a 15-year-old? Because if this is a sworn in, dues paying, tax paying citizen 15-year-old serving as a police officer, I want to read some of the bylaws in this place, because suddenly I'm thinking things might not be adding up quite the way they should. What's up, Mr. Bean? Good to see you, bud. George Ward. I know, man.
It is a painful subject for the residents of Pitcairn Island. Pitcairn is now the last British colony in the Pacific. This island and several uninhabited islands adjacent to it are the last possessions of Great Britain in the Pacific Ocean. The island is independent de facto, but formally it is still part of the Commonwealth. Britain is responsible for the protection of the island and justice on it. Interestingly enough, when Pitcairn Island officially became a colony in 1838, a democratic electoral system was introduced there for all adult residents. Thus, it became the first territory in Britain in which women received the right to vote. In 1937, 233 people lived there. The population had reached its peak. Currently, there are 49 people living on the island. Almost all young people have immigrated to New Zealand and Australia.
Hey, Brooklyn. chick. I
80%
missed
of
you.
the
Hold
current
on. I'll
budget
catch
comes
you.
from tourism,
There you go.
so they love visitors on
Welcome
this
to the show,
island.
darling. Good to see you.
There is no hotel there, so the visitors stay with the locals as their guests. The main thing is not to mention the case of the pedophiles and the massacre of 1793. They don't like to talk about it.
All right, giggity giggity. Okay, so I got a bonus video over here. My question is, do we want to do it? Do we want to do it? I found this guy, and it's kind of funny the way I found him. I was going to do a reading of a particular story from H.P. Lovecraft, and when I looked it up, I found this dude who had just uploaded it like a couple of hours before, and I went and listened to his version of it and went, wow, that's pretty good. So I figured we'd check it out for a minute and do his whole posting of link thing. Wait, no, we still got the earthquakes to go through. We're almost at the fucking time limit too. Oh, darling, we're going to do it anyway. Earthquakes. Okay. I cannot remember the name of the earthquake in 1912. The Midland? The mid. Anyway, okay, so earthquakes occur just about every day, 10, 12 times a day on the West Coast. You fuckers sitting around on a bowl of jelly over yonder just letting it jiggle around under your feet and you're freaking me the fuck out with it. I don't appreciate that shit. The ground moves about twice. My ass is moving somewhere a little more solid. But there's one catch to that. I'm in Georgia, right on the edge of Stone Mountain, which means we're on the largest single piece of rock on Earth. So when the ground moves here, it's fucking serious. It's not just a little bit. It's a bunch. The last time we had a major earthquake on the East Coast, it leveled Charleston. Leveled it. I don't mean like Chicago fire, like somebody kicked the, no. I mean, it knocked all the buildings down and then the fire happened. Like, no one was really burned alive. It was all collapse damage. It's horrendous. But Charleston's built on a bay, a Carolina bay, if I'm not mistaken. And those things, they're not exactly solid.
The Charleston size.
We're going to go back to the beginning on this one. All right. So when you have an earthquake that happens, say, anywhere west of the Mississippi, it bounces around between several different plates when it takes place. And because of that, it breaks up the energy dissipation across these different plates. But when the East Coast plates has a movement, it's serious because it only has one or two major plate chunks. And since there's only one or two of them, what's up, Mr. Self-Destruction? Good to see you, bud. Because there's only one or two, there's nowhere really to dissipate the energy to. And even when you dissipate the energy in multiple directions, it only has a limited amount of space for it to bounce around. Byproduct of that means that you not only have a stronger initial earthquake, you typically have measurable pre-tremors and significant aftershocks. So after an East Coast quake, not only will it probably register somewhere in the 3 to 6 range initially, the aftershocks are bound to be 5s, 4s. So not only will they be strong enough for you to notice and feel, but the earthquake itself will level most brick buildings. Anything above like 3 stories is trashed because of the wavelength that comes through the ground. And also, anyone on the coast is going to have an issue due to subsidence and liquefaction. So if your house is built on sand, it will fall.
In the early morning of the 16th of December 1811, something strange happened in the United States. The ground began to shake violently. Here in Asheville in North Carolina, for instance, the shaking, although not severe enough to cause any significant damage or fatalities, woke much of the town. Most of the people living there had never experienced an earthquake, let alone such a strong one, and were understandably terrified. An eyewitness account of the events was published a few days later in a local paper. On its own, this seems unremarkable. What makes this interesting is how widespread this phenomenon was. Similar articles were published in newspapers all over the country, like in Natchez and Charleston to the south, and Washington, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and New York to the north, to only name a few. Places that, mind you, are as far away from each other as the UK is from Greece. It seems essentially the entire United States was shaken that night. And this wasn't the end of it. Strong earthquakes like this continued to occur.
That's the one I was trying to remember, the New Madrid fault. That is probably one of the biggest threats pending, right up there with Yellowstone. And these two things may be more closely related than most people believe. I've been meaning to do this. There is a particular river that runs especially close to the Yellowstone caldera. It's been creeping its way in that direction for the past few years because of limited rainfall and more erosion. It's kind of chewing its way through the bank. And if that river turns into Yellowstone, it could trigger an explosion in the next 100 years or so, depending on how much rainfall we get at that point. Get squatched. I don't know, man. Yay, I'm a grandfather. I have a grandbaby, like full on with 10 toes, like 10 fingers, 10 toes, makes noises, all that stuff. Pukes on people. It was a good deal. Went up to the hospital. They had one laying around. We just picked it out and come home, as far as I understand it. I mean, I'm not exactly sure where babies come from, but that's how that one worked. We decided to go with one that wasn't quite as pasty as me, so that, you know, they'd tan better. It was a good choice.
Regularly for almost 2 months until February the following year. Naturally, people were very eager to figure out where these tremors came from, where the epicenter of these earthquakes was. But because communication was slow in these days, this, of course, took a while. As the letters and newspapers from further inland slowly began to arrive in the large cities on the East Coast, it became clear pretty quickly that the further west they came from, the more dramatic they became. And the most terrifying accounts came from here, from the Mississippi Valley in the new Louisiana Territory. What the people of this region had experienced in the winter of 1811.
All right. So consider this. The Mississippi is not where it is because, what's up, Joko? Good to see you, bud. Right. Yeah. You'll be leveled. Like, just, you might as well just smoke you a big fatty and grab your wife's ass as the light spreads over you. I mean, why not? I don't see anything else you're going to be able to do about it that close. I mean, over here, we've got to dodge the lava bombs and crap. It'll be fine. I'm pretty quick on my feet. We'll be all right. Sasquatch been doing this for millions of years. It's okay. But no, the Mississippi River is not where it's at because of anything other than plate tectonics. It occupies one of the lowest points in between the Appalachian and the Rocky Mountains. And for that reason, the Mississippi River by default sort of runs down a massive fault line that just doesn't move often. And part of that fault line, I don't know how much of it they mapped now, but they, at the time that I did most of my reading on the New Madrid earthquakes, they had mapped out a few thousand miles of fault line in 2 different directions. And they were talking about there being multiple different microplates that are basically just grinding together under the surface. And these move quite often, but the ones that cause major damage is when the top plate rub against each other, when they break loose. And in the New Madrid series of quakes, it moved one town from the east side to the west side of the Mississippi and ran the river backwards for 12 hours. Enough earth lowered. It's crazy.
In 1812 is without question the most remarkable but also horrifying series of earthquakes that took place in the United States. In total, over 2,000 earthquakes shook the region, of which some reached a magnitude of 7 and even 7.5 or greater. These were, by many measures, the strongest and most powerful earthquakes ever in the contiguous United States. And they happened
A 7.5 might kill you by slapping you with the ground, by taking the ground away, letting you fall for a split second, and then slapping you upside the head with a piece of granite. Just whop through your feet because you're still standing up. So,
notably, in a very unusual place. In a place that you wouldn't normally think of when you think of earthquakes in the US. Not somewhere along the west coast, but instead right in the center of it, near the town of New Madrid. But what's perhaps even more surprising is that even today, more than 200 years later, we still don't exactly know what caused them. This is a map of the strongest earthquakes that occurred in North America in the past decade. As you can see, they exclusively happened along the west coast. This is, of course, no coincidence. Earthquakes are, as you probably know, the result of plate tectonics. When the huge slabs that make up the Earth's crust bend and deform, stress builds up, slowly but steadily over years and decades. At some point, when the stress exceeds the strength of the rocks, they break and the plates snap back into a relaxed position, releasing the buildup stress spontaneously and violently all at once. The area where this deformation is most severe is, of course, the plate boundaries and boundary zones, where the plates collide, whereas the plate interiors remain mostly undeformed. In the US, these plate boundaries lie exclusively on the west coast, and that's where seismic activity is concentrated. But if you now extend the time frame to include earthquakes from the 19th and 20th century as well, you can see that strong earthquakes can also occur in the interior of the North American plate, far away from these boundaries. While these so-called intraplate earthquakes are clearly more rare, they do happen, and understanding them is therefore important, not just for the people that live in these regions, but also because they seem to contradict what we believe to know about earthquakes and how they are triggered. Because of this, geologists have spent a lot of time in the past decades trying to figure out what exactly happened in New Madrid, and possibly more vitally, if it can happen again. If these were just some freak events, or if they happen, like earthquakes, near plate boundaries, with a somewhat predictable regularity. Since the area began to be studied in more detail in the 80s and 90s, we have in fact recorded regular and continuous seismic activity here. Dozens, hundreds of earthquakes every year. Most of them are too small to be felt, but they clearly show that something is happening here. And this is not the only place where this happens. Although certainly the most active and best studied seismic zone, zones of this localized seismic activity could also be identified in other places in the interior of the North American plate, like here, here, and here. And if history is any indication, which for earthquakes is usually the case, then these zones are very much capable of producing large and potentially devastating earthquakes, comparable in magnitude to earthquakes near plate boundaries. In 2011, for instance, a 5.8 magnitude earthquake shook the Virginia seismic zone. While there were no reported fatalities and only a small number of injuries, the shaking did, however, cause between $200 to $300 million in damage, most of it uninsured. In 1886, the Charleston seismic zone was hit by a 7.3 magnitude earthquake. 60 people were killed, thousands were injured, and much of Charleston was destroyed. And then, of course, there was the series of major earthquakes that shook the region around New Madrid in the Mississippi Valley in the winter of 1811 and 1812, the strongest of which were as strong as the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the deadliest earthquake in U.S. history. So clearly, despite being far away from active plate boundaries, and despite the lack of an obvious mechanism that could explain the buildup of stresses in these zones, they nevertheless can and have produced devastating earthquakes. In New Madrid in particular, field research has revealed that strong earthquakes, comparable to the 1811-1812 series, have occurred here regularly for over 2,000 years, with average return periods of somewhere between 200 to 800 years. Based on this history, the USGS now puts the likelihood of a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake in this seismic zone in the next 50 years at about 25 to 40%, and the likelihood of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake still at about 7 to 10%. This is frighteningly high, considering what an earthquake of that magnitude could mean for the region and the eastern United States in general. But these are of course only very rough estimates based to a large degree on what happened here in the past. Our understanding of the processes that take place now, today, is still limited. Although we have made incredible progress in identifying what makes New Madrid geologically unique, we are still lacking a universally agreed upon model that fully explains the ongoing and continuous buildup and release of stresses here. And such a model is critical if we want to accurately predict the likelihood of future earthquakes and the hazard associated with them. At the time of the earthquakes, New Madrid and the land surrounding it had only been part of the US for a few years. Before that, the region was, as part of the Louisiana Territory, owned by, going backwards in time, the French, the Spanish, and again, the French. The town was established in 1789 as a Spanish colony composed mostly of American settlers that, as a condition to settle there, had to take the oath of allegiance to the Spanish king. That's why the town is called New Madrid, although it is pronounced differently today. The Spanish minister to the United States who had granted the colonists the land to settle on hoped that a colony of Americans loyal to the Spanish crown would prevent the unwanted expansion of the US into Spanish Louisiana. Beyond that, the colony was also meant as a way to ensure Spanish control over the commerce on and beyond Mississippi. Despite early setbacks such as floods and food shortages, The liberal land policy of the Spanish authorities nevertheless stimulated westward immigration to the region, so that by the turn of the century, the population had risen from a few dozen to a few hundred. This made New Madrid the largest settlement between St. Louis and the Gulf Coast, and therefore the most important station on the upper Mississippi and the port of entry for all vessels.
I was in Augusta, I think back in mid-90s, where, and I don't know that it was, I'm sure it was registered somewhere, but at some point in time in the mid-90s, I was walking down one of those big-ass hills in Augusta in Georgia, and a 4.3 earthquake hit. And it was just enough that it caused my feet to kind of stutter on the pavement, and like everyone I saw in view all tripped at the same time. Every single person on the street that was walking, whether they were crossing a crosswalk, stepping up on a curb, stepping down from a curb, but I mean, like I said, it's a really hilly area. So like everybody was going up or down hills. And when the ground moves, you really don't get a preparation for it. You don't get to hop like in an elevator.
Going up and down the river, some 100 boats on a good day. The Spanish period came to an end in 1800 with the secret transfer of Spanish Louisiana, including New Orleans and St. Louis, to France. Only 3 years later, Napoleon, busy with his war in Europe and no longer interested in a French colonial empire in North America, and to prevent it from falling into the hands of the British, in turn gave Louisiana to the United States for a mere $15 million, roughly $300 million in today's money. Through the Louisiana Purchase, the city of New Madrid and New Madrid County officially became U.S. territory in 1804, to the delight of its largely American population. But this joy was only short-lived, as only 8 years later, the town was all but completely destroyed by the earthquakes we will now talk about, together with most of the other villages and towns that had sprung up around it up and down the Mississippi. This is roughly and summarized the historical backdrop. Let's now take a look at some of the eyewitness accounts from the people that were there when the earthquakes happened, so you can fully appreciate how devastating they were. William Pierce was part of a convoy of shallow-bottom boats, or flatboats, taking goods from Pittsburgh down the Ohio and Mississippi River to New Orleans. When the first earthquakes hit, they were anchored for the night, a few days away from New Madrid. His account of what happened became one of the most quoted and reprinted accounts of the earthquakes in the following weeks and months. Precisely at 2 o'clock on Monday morning, we were all alarmed by the violent and convulsive agitation of the boats, accompanied by a noise similar to that which would have been produced by running over a sandbar. Every man was immediately roused and rushed upon deck. The idea of an earthquake then suggested itself to my mind, and this idea was confirmed by a second shock, and 2 others in immediate succession. These continued for the space of 8 minutes. So complete and general had been the convulsion, that a tremulous motion was communicated to the very leaves on the surface of the earth. A few yards from the spot where we lay, the body of a large oak was snapped in two, and the falling part precipitated to the margin of the river. The trees in the forest shook like rushes. The alarming clattering of their branches may be compared to the effect which would be produced by a severe wind passing through a large canebrake. Exposed to a most unpleasant alternative, we were compelled to remain where we were for the night, or subject ourselves to imminent hazard in navigating through the innumerable obstructions in the river. Considering the danger of running twofold, we concluded to remain. At the dawn of the day, we experienced a fifth shock, more severe than either of the preceding. It was indeed most providential that we have started, for such was the strength of this last shock, that the bank on which we were but a few moments since attached was rent and fell into the river, whilst the trees rushed from the forests, precipitating themselves into the water with force sufficient to have dashed us into 1,000 atoms. It was now light, and we had an opportunity of beholding in full extent all the horrors of our situation. During the first 4 shocks, tremendous and uninterrupted explosions resembling a discharge of artillery was heard from the opposite shore. At that time, I imputed them to the falling of the riverbanks. The 5th shock explained the real cause. Wherever the veins of the earthquake ran, there was a volcanic discharge of combustible matter to great heights. An incessant rumbling was heard below, and the bed of the river was excessively agitated. Whilst the water assumed a turbid and boiling appearance near our boat, a spout of confined air breaking its way through the waters burst forth, and with a loud report, discharged mud, sticks, etc. from the river's bed at least 30 feet above the surface. These spoutings were frequent, and in many places appeared to rise to the very heavens. Large trees, which had lain for
Yeah, bud.
ages at the bottom of the river, were shot up in thousands of instances, some with their roots uppermost and their tops planted. Others were hurled into the air. Many again were only loosened and floated upon the surface. Never was a scene more replete with terrific threatenings of death. With the most lively sense of this awful crisis, we contemplated in mute astonishment a scene which completely beggars description, and of which the most glowing imagination is inadequate to form a picture. Here, the earth, river, etc., torn with furious convulsions, opened in huge trenches, whose deep jaws were instantaneously closed. There, through 1,000 vents, sulphurous streams gushed from its very bowels, leaving vast and almost unfathomable caverns. Everywhere, nature itself seemed tottering on the verge of dissolution. During the day, there was with very little intermission a continued series of shocks, attended with innumerable explosions like the rolling of thunder. The bed of the river was incessantly disturbed, and the water boiled severely in every part. I consider ourselves as having been in the greatest danger from the numerous instances of boiling directly under our boat. Fortunately for us, however, they were not attended with eruptions.
All right. So the fear here is if methane or air pockets or anything else bubbles from underneath the boat, it lowers the density of the water and can literally suck a ship straight to the bottom. It'd be just like falling through air. There's no buoyancy provided by water with bubbles in it. So that's a real fear. They could have been sailing along, hit one of these ejections of gas, and just fell to the bottom of it. Just by the time the bubbles are gone out of the water, the ship's on the bottom of the and it's suctioned down by the pressure of the water that fills the gap. So literally.
One of the spouts which we had seen raising under the boat would inevitably have sunk it, and probably have blown it into 1,000 fragments. Our ears were constantly assailed with the crashing of timber. The banks were instantaneously crushed down, and fell with all their growth into the water. It was no less astonishing than alarming to behold the oldest trees of the forest, whose firm roots had withstood 1,000 storms and weathered the sternest tempests, quivering and shaking with the violence of the shocks, whilst their heads were whipped together with a quick and rapid motion. Many were torn from their native soil and hurled with tremendous force into the river. One of these, whose huge trunk at least 3 feet in diameter had been shattered, was thrown better than 100 yards from the bank and planted into the bed of the river, there to stand a terror to future navigators. Several small islands have been annihilated, and from appearances, many others must suffer the same fate. As we descended the river, everything was a scene of ruin and devastation.
Hello, Gabby. Welcome to the show.
This horrifying description of the events on the 16th of December was mirrored by many other people that lived and worked in the northern part of the Mississippi Valley at that moment in time. And this was, if you remember, only the beginning. Besides the aftershocks, which continued for months, years, even decades, there were 2 more major shocks as strong and even stronger as the first ones. This is another reason why this series of earthquakes is so unique, because it was a whole chain of major earthquakes that happened in relatively quick succession, triggered by a complex network of faults. The next main shock happened on January 23rd the following year, and the final on the 7th of February. The last one was also the strongest one, with an estimated magnitude of 7.5 to 7.8. It happened here, right in the center of the New Madrid seismic zone, between the 2 faults that had triggered the earlier earthquakes. Unlike the previous shocks, which were triggered by strike-slip faults that result mostly in horizontal offset, this final earthquake happened on a thrust fault which produces vertical offset. Unsurprisingly, the effects the earthquake on February the 7th had, particularly on the river, were much more severe. Of course, the shape of the Mississippi was very different back then. It looked more like this, although this is probably also not entirely accurate. East of this line, the land subsided. To the west, it was lifted up. The difference in elevation was about 5 to 6 meters, or 20 feet. Because the fault cut through the rivers in 2 places, the uplift caused 2 huge rapids or waterfalls spanning the entire breadths of the Mississippi. It even temporarily blocked the flow of water and pushed it back, so that the whole river, the largest river in the US, mind you, ran backwards against its natural current for almost an hour, carrying boats many miles upstream. This is the retelling of an account by a boatman who was on the river when that happened, moored about 13 miles above New Madrid.
All right, so imagine it. You're sailing down the river one day and you're just tooling along and everything's cool when suddenly the whole world turns to jelly and the river stops and then starts flowing backwards. Now, this is more than just a dangerous situation. This is absolutely suicidal. This barge is not designed to go backwards up a river. There is no controls on this thing. The second that river changes direction, the tug pushing the barge, whatever method they're using, has to figure out how to get to the back end of the weight. Otherwise, they're just along for the ride, bud. Not much you can do but delay its progress, which is what you do for a little while. But eventually, it's moving downriver. There's nothing you can do about that.
He was awakened by a tremendous roaring noise, felt his vessel violently shaken, and observed the trees over the bank falling in every direction. He immediately cut his cable and put off into the middle of the river, where he soon found the current changed and the boat hurried up for about the space of a minute with the velocity of the swiftest horse. He was obliged to hold his hand to his head to keep his hat on. On the currents running its natural course, which it did gradually, he continued to proceed down the river, and at about daylight he came to a most terrific fall, which, he thinks, was at least 6 feet perpendicular, extending across the river, and about half a mile.
No, Carrie, you're wrong. A thug McCoy is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Wide. The whirls and ripplings of this rapid were such that the vessel was altogether unmanageable, and destruction seemed inevitable. He and his men were constantly employed in pumping and bailing, by which, and the aid of Providence, he says, he got safe through. On his arrival at New Madrid, he found that place a complete wreck, sunk about 12 feet below its level, and entirely deserted. Its inhabitants, with those of the adjacent country, who had fled there for refuge, were encamped in its neighborhood. He represents their cries as truly distressing. Of nearly 30 loaded boats, only this and one more escaped destruction. Several lives were lost among the boatmen. New Madrid was indeed most severely affected by the earthquake, being only 10 miles away from the epicenter and a mile or two above where the fault cut the Mississippi a second time. Eliza Bryan, a schoolteacher and one of the few people that had not fled the region after the town's initial destruction 2 months earlier, gave us this vivid description of what the effects of the earthquakes looked like, including the last one of the main shocks. She writes, "On the 7th, about 4 o'clock a.m., a concussion took place so much more violent than those that had preceded it. At first, the Mississippi seemed to recede from its banks, and its waters gathering up like a mountain, leaving for the moment many boats, which were here on their way to New Orleans, on bare sand, in which time the poor sailors made their escape from them. It then rising 15 to 20 feet perpendicularly and expanding, as it were, at the same moment, the banks were overflowed with a retrograde current, rapid as a torrent. The boats, which before had been left on the sand, were now torn from their moorings, and suddenly driven up a little creek, at the mouth of which they laid, to the distance, in some instances, of nearly a quarter of a mile. The river, falling immediately, as rapid as it had risen, receded in its banks again with such violence that it took with it whole groves of young cottonwood trees, which ledged its borders. They were broken off with such regularity, in some instances, that persons who had not witnessed the fact would be difficultly persuaded that it had not been the work of art. A great many fish were left on the banks, being unable to keep pace with the water. The river was literally covered with the wrecks of boats, and it's said that one was wrecked in which there was a lady and 6 children, all of whom were lost. In all the hard shocks mentioned, the earth was horribly torn to pieces. The surface of hundreds of acres was, from time to time, covered over in various depths by the sand which issued from the fissures, which were made in great numbers all over this country, some of which closed up immediately after they had vomited forth their sand and water. It is impossible to say what the depths of the fissures were. We have reason to believe that some of them are very deep." Aftershocks could be felt every 20 minutes for the next few days, and after that with decreasing frequency and strength for more than 10 years. It took about a week until the obstructions in the river were washed away to the point that the rapids were reasonably passable again. To the east, where the land had subsided, the river flooded the surrounding woodlands along its shores, creating huge swampy forests that would actually become the site of an important battle during the Civil War 50 years later, and a huge lake that still exists today. The trees that still rise from the water of this lake to this day are a stark reminder that this is earthquake territory. This should be enough to convey how powerful and devastating these earthquakes were. Of course, the damage was most severe in the Mississippi Valley, an area relatively sparsely populated at the time. But as we have heard in the opening, they were felt over a much greater area, up to 1,000 miles away in some.
Hey, Ajot, welcome to the show. Good to see you, darling. I haven't seen you in a minute. Typos are fine, babe.
Cases. Even in Charleston, South Carolina, more than 500 miles away, they were still strong enough to damage a few buildings. And yet, despite this, despite all the chilling eyewitness accounts, despite how severe and widespread the effects were felt and the impacts these quakes had in and beyond the Mississippi region, it even resulted in the very first disaster relief bill ever passed by Congress, which was a complete disaster in its own right, doing practically nothing for the people affected and only resulting in huge amounts of speculation and fraud. Despite all this astonishing series of earthquakes was virtually forgotten only 50 years later. The history of these quakes was only slowly rediscovered in the second half of the 20th century. One question that is obviously impossible to avoid when talking about these historic earthquakes is what would happen if something similar happened today? What damage and devastation could or would that cause? Before we can answer this question, however, we need to understand two important factors about the geology of this region. Factors that alone, without even talking about the human element, like building codes, infrastructure, population size, and all that, make earthquakes here much more dangerous. The first has to do with sand. The entire Mississippi floodplain is essentially one giant pit of sand, hundreds of meters deep in some places. The sand was deposited here by two forces.
All right. So we have general ideas as to the depth of sand in these locations. And when an earthquake takes place directly in the New Madrid fault area, it's essentially rattling around 5 or 6 big ass chunks of rock that are just wedged there in the sand that's in that chasm. And that chasm ranges between a couple of inches wide all the way through to 30 or 40 feet wide, but the river runs through it and keeps it full of sand. So you don't really see a fault there, but it's there, and it's a big one. Yes, I'm fear-mongering. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Forces. The first is, of course, the Mississippi itself. When rivers flow from the highlands and mountains where they originate down into the lowlands, they carry sediments with them, sand, silt, and clay. Some of that is deposited on the floodplain as the river meanders across it over the centuries and millennia, and the rest makes its way into the ocean, usually. How much sediment rivers can transport is illustrated very well by the Mississippi River Delta, a stretch of land that today is inhabited by over 1 million people, most notably in New Orleans. But 4,000 years ago, when on the other side of the ocean the pyramids were being built, none of this land did exist. The Mississippi created these 8,000 square miles of land, an area larger than Northern Ireland, in only a few thousand years, simply by carrying sediment downstream. The other force responsible for the large quantities of sand in this region was the ocean. When we go even further back in time, 80 million years or so, we know that much of the southern United States was underwater, including the so-called Mississippi Embayment, the northern part of today's floodplain near Memphis and New Madrid. Why this is actually an important aspect of this story. Obviously, sea levels were much higher, so it's easy to assume that this region was simply flooded by the Gulf of Mexico as water levels rose. However, only about 10 to 20 million years earlier, this deep basin was actually the opposite. It was part of a huge mountain range, so clearly something unusual has happened here. We'll talk about that later. After the formation of this basin, the Gulf of Mexico slowly filled it up with marine sediment from the south and the Proto-Mississippi with river sediment from the north, so that today the entire 1 to 2 kilometer deep hole is completely filled with sand and clay. That's why the Mississippi Embayment is essentially just one giant pit of sand. If you look at a cross-section of the sediment layers below Memphis, the largest city in the region, for example, you can see that it is not underlain by rock, but by roughly 1 kilometer or 3,000 feet of unconsolidated loose waterlogged sediment. This has some benefits. Because these sand layers that sit between layers of much finer clay are essentially just giant underground lakes, They provide easy access to clean drinking water. In fact, the water from this aquifer supplies about a third of the people in Memphis with water. Side note, there was a few years ago actually quite a high-profile lawsuit regarding this aquifer between the state of Mississippi and the city of Memphis. Because Memphis sits right at the border with Mississippi and big parts of the aquifer also lie below its territory, Mississippi alleged that the city of Memphis, specifically the Memphis Light, Gas, and Water Division, had, over multiple decades, unlawfully pumped hundreds of billions of gallons of groundwater that naturally occur under Mississippi out of the aquifer and sued the city for almost $1 billion in damages. But both a U.S. district judge as well as the Supreme Court later rejected the lawsuit. Now, where this huge wet sandpit becomes a problem is when you have an earthquake in the crust below. Because loose soil consists of individual particles that can move independently from one another, it is affected by the earthquake's waves much more severely than solid rock is. It is particularly problematic when the soil is wet. You might have observed this when shaking a bag or box with loosely packed objects. Everything gets packed much more efficiently. It gets compressed essentially. When this happens to wet sand, where the pockets between the particles are not filled with air but with water that can't immediately go anywhere, the pore pressure increases. This reduces the friction between the individual particles. It pushes them apart essentially, to the point that during strong earthquakes of magnitude 5.5 or higher, friction can actually reduce to zero, meaning the sand particles can move around freely and the soil essentially starts to behave like a viscous liquid. This is known as soil liquefaction, and it is one of the most destructive earthquake hazards. It essentially turns the ground into quicksand, which, needless to say, results in tremendous damage to things built on top of it. Liquefaction causes houses and other heavy structures to sink into the ground or tilt, hollow structures like underground pipes and tanks to become buoyant, break and rise to the surface. It undermines the foundations of roads, bridges, and dams, causes landsliding and soil subsidence. That's why it is so dangerous, because even if the structure on top is in itself strong enough to withstand the earthquake, the ground failure below can still render it unusable. Liquefaction has been observed during most major earthquakes around the world, but the New Madrid earthquakes still stand out simply because of the extent and the scale of the liquefaction they caused. One way we know this is through sand blows. If you remember, many eyewitness accounts mention eruptions of water and sand that shot up out of the ground. That's what sand blows essentially are. It's when the pressure below the solid upper soil layer becomes so high that the liquefied water-sand mix begins to rise through vents or fissures in the ground and erupts or boils onto the surface, leaving behind a layer of sand or silt on the ground, often in the shape of a circular or elliptical cone. On photos of the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, you can see these sand blows a lot. They are a clear indication of severe soil liquefaction, which is the main reason why this earthquake, despite its relatively modest magnitude, caused such an extraordinary amount of damage. The liquefaction covered an area of roughly 30 to 50 square kilometers around the epicenter, which was unfortunately situated right under the city. This made it the most costly earthquake in New Zealand's history, with estimated damages of around 20 to 30 billion US dollars. But now compare this to the New Madrid earthquakes, which induced severe soil liquefaction over an area of at least 10,000 square kilometers. And even beyond this primary region, there is still evidence for liquefaction, in some cases 250 kilometers away from the epicenter, near St. Louis and south of Memphis. Now, some of that is obviously explained by the larger magnitude. Each earthquake released somewhere between 25 to 100 times the amount of energy of the Christchurch earthquake. But it is also due to the unusual geology of the Mississippi Valley, which makes the region very susceptible to liquefaction. The thousands and thousands of sand blows that you can still find buried in the soil, or even see at the surface as light-colored patches in plowed fields all across the Mississippi embayment, are clear evidence of this. Many are also unusually large. Normally, individual sand blows are only maybe a few meters in diameter at most. But in New Madrid, many are 40, 50, 60 meters in diameter, with vents that alone are already almost a meter thick. All this confirms that these must have been very powerful earthquakes. But there's more. This is a photo of a sand blow that was taken almost 100 years after the earthquakes.
Move.
It still clearly shows what looks like an enormous explosion crater. We now know that in extreme cases, when the pressure builds up too fast or the top soil layer is too strong, it can actually lead to so much hydraulic pressure underground that the sand blow will literally explode, throwing not just water and sand, but also everything that's in the ground, like stones, rocks, and in the case of the Mississippi floodplain, often a coal-like substance many meters into the air. According to the eyewitness accounts, this happened a lot during the New Madrid earthquakes. So this is the first problem, that the Mississippi embayment is perhaps the best place, if you pardon the wording, for large-scale soil liquefaction in the world. One more side note. New Madrid is, of course, not the only place where this has happened, the explosion of liquefied sand. Similar craters formed, for example, during strong earthquakes in India and Yellowstone.
Yeah, good night,
And this
bud.
picture from before
Appreciate
is
you
actually
coming
from
by.
southern Italy, which was hit by a not dissimilar series of unusual earthquakes in the year 1783, which killed over 30,000 people. A few years ago in Spain, the remnants of an ancient Roman city were unearthed just a few kilometers east of Madrid.
I don't know,
The
Carrie.
old
I hear
Madrid,
George
if you
is
will.
wonderful this time.
At
of
its
year.
time, it was likely one of the largest cities in the region, until the 4th century, when it was, together with its neighboring towns, abruptly abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere after what looks like a strong earthquake shook the region. One of the most notable earthquake features archaeologists uncovered were these distinct explosion craters right in the city, which seems to have formed during the earthquake as a result of the liquefaction of the river sediments that the city was built on. Many of these craters are at least 2 to 3 meters in diameter and lie, in some cases, directly under the houses. Imagine for a minute what kind of terrifying experience this must have been, especially considering this was more than 500 years before any human-made
I'll
explosion.
consider it.
Curiously, at the bottom of these craters, archaeologists have found dozens and dozens of tools, such as knives, billhooks, and axes. It looks like they were thrown into the craters after the explosions by the Romans, possibly as a means to appease the gods, who they undoubtedly blamed for this catastrophe. But back to the New Madrid. We already touched on this, but one of the most remarkable effects of the earthquakes was over how far of a distance they were felt. They woke up people in New York City and beyond, 1,000 miles away from the epicenter. Why is best explained by this image. It shows the thickness of the North American plate. This large blue area, which includes basically everything east of the Rocky Mountains, is where the plate is the thickest, 200 kilometers or more. The west coast of the United States, on the other hand, only has a thickness of less than 100 kilometers. That's because it is much younger. It formed only during the last couple of 100 million years. While this part of the North American plate formed 1.5, 2, and to a large degree even more than 2.5 billion years ago. As a result, the crust under the central and eastern United States is much colder, and most importantly, much denser than the crust below the western United States. Think of it that way. The western crust is like a piece of wood, not very dense with lots of air pockets that can absorb shock waves, while the eastern crust is more like a piece of metal that can transfer vibrations really, really well and over large distances. Let's now compare what happens when you have two equally strong earthquakes in these very different parts of the continent. This is a Did You Feel It map, compiled by the USGS for a 5.7 magnitude earthquake in Greenville, California in 2013. It is essentially data collected from the population about where and how strong the earthquake was felt, which is then compiled into this color-coded map. Yellow and orange mark strong and very strong shaking that caused minor to moderate damage. This was mostly felt in the immediate epicenter region. Blues and greens mark zones with weak to light shaking that didn't cause any damage but could nevertheless be felt. This zone extended, for this particular earthquake, maybe 200 to 300 kilometers in every direction. Beyond that, the seismic waves became too weak to even be felt. Now, let's compare this with an equally strong earthquake in the eastern United States. This is the 2011 Virginia earthquake. The zoom factor is exactly the same. The difference is pretty obvious right off the bat. We have severe and violent shaking near the epicenter that can and has caused significant damage to houses in that region. But more importantly, for this comparison, we have a very large area of strong and very strong shaking extending all the way to Washington and Baltimore. Landslides were still triggered 250 kilometers away from the epicenter, 200 kilometers further than during any similar sized earthquake on the West Coast, and indeed elsewhere in the world. This increases the area where landslides are expected to occur in this region by 20 times. This increase is also mirrored in how far the earthquake was felt. If we zoom out, you can see that this area too is about 20 times larger. Here's the data for another earthquake of that magnitude in Oklahoma in 2016, which is a bit closer to the New Madrid seismic zone. These three earthquakes released the same amount of energy, and yet they were felt much further in the east, which shows that you can't really compare them, even if, or precisely because, they had the same magnitude. By now you should understand why, from a geological standpoint alone, this is a very bad spot for strong earthquakes. First, you have an old, dense crust that can transfer seismic waves really, really well over very large distances. And then, on top of that, in particular in the epicentral region of the Mississippi Valley, you have a huge area of loose waterlogged sediments, which will shake like crazy. And if all of this wasn't already bad enough, the damage potential is, of course, even further amplified by the fact that this part of the country isn't even remotely as prepared for strong earthquakes as, say, California is, both from an engineering but also from a societal standpoint. We will talk about that in more detail in part 2. Now, one thing we also haven't touched on thus far is, of course, why earthquakes happen here. For that, we have to dive a bit deeper into the geology of the New Madrid seismic zone, which, because this video is already very long, we will also have to do next time. Hopefully, you will join us for this video too.
Fantastic. All right. I have one last tidbit prepared for this particular evening.
Welcome back.
Largely narration. Actually, there's a fault line directly under Florida. It's ancient, and I don't know of very many events of seismic activity measured from there. They're relatively rare, but it's a very, very deep fault. Very deep. And yes, Florida gets earthquakes. And it would be catastrophic if a major earthquake happened under Florida. You hear about California sliding off into the sea. Fucking Florida would actually do it. Like, no bullshit. If a major earthquake hit the Florida region, we would probably lose 3/4 of the state, maybe. I mean, the entire freaking peninsula is only, what, 25 feet above sea level or some crap like that? And I don't have New York Outcast's email address, but I can't forward that down. There's no way I can do it. But if the opportunity presents itself, I certainly will. All right, so the name of this particular channel, which is pretty cool, I think, given how capricious some people naming are. Capricious Cabrera. It's pretty cool. Function. We're going to hope that we make it like another few minutes on this whole scene, because I'm not going through this whole thing. I just want you to see the style of video that he does. And then I'm out. What's up, Tom? How you doing, bud? I have to do an abstract craft. You see the map I put up? Just getting warmed up.
Back, everybody. This tale is called The Transition of Juan Romero by H.P. Lovecraft. Before we get started, everybody get in the right mindset. Maybe put on a cup of coffee or get you a nice cup of hot tea.
I'd advise a big fat stogie joint.
And relax. Of the events which took place at the Norton Mine on October 18th and 19th, 1894, I have no desire to speak. A sense of duty to science is all that impels me to recall, in these last years of my life, scenes and happenings fraught with a terror doubly acute because I cannot wholly define it. But I believe that before I die, I should tell what I know of the, shall I say, transition of Juan Romero.
He has a gear list he wants to share with you, and he has sent the list of links and everything to me. For some weird reason, he doesn't believe that you have the capability of emailing him, and I don't have the capability of emailing you without at least a little facilitation back and forth in some kind of direction. But y'all are both here. I don't understand why y'all don't just hash it out, man. Go for it.
Origin need not be related to posterity. In fact, I fancy it is better that they should not be. For when a man suddenly migrates to the states of the colonies, he leaves his past behind him. Besides, what I once was is not in the least relevant to my narrative, save perhaps the fact that during my service in India, I was
more at home amongst white-bearded native teachers than amongst my brother officers. I've delved not a little into odd Eastern lore when overtaken by the calamities which brought about my new life in America's vast West, a life wherein I found it well to accept a name, my present one.
All right. So the only thing I would suggest this guy do at all, although you know how visual I am, he's got a great reading voice, a good meter, an excellent presentation. His sound is top notch, but we need just a little bit of some kind of a background thing going on. Something. What have I got over here? Nope, that's not it. I think I've used them all up. I don't think I have any actually set up for that. I no longer have that loop set up. Might have this one. Yeah, some of this, right? Just some little. And then you turn it down enough so it's barely audible.
Which is very common and carries no meaning. In the summer and autumn of 1894, I dwelt in the drear expanses of the Cactus Mountains, employed as a common laborer at the celebrated Norton Mine, whose discovery by an aged prospector some years before had turned the surrounding regions from a nearly unpeopled waste to a seething cauldron of sordid life. A cavern of gold lying deep below a mountain lake had enriched its.
See what I mean? It just adds a little bit of tension to the presentation. You could throw up any number of visuals. You could go get some fish from some live stream or some sunsets, sunrises, mountain villages, that kind of stuff. But given that it's a H.P. Lovecraft story, I think it should be dark and brooding. And then you combine that with the proper, like, nerve-wracking tune that just sets your teeth a little bit on edge.
Venerable finder beyond his wildest dreams, and now formed the seat of extensive tunneling operations on the part of the corporation.
Fuck this shit, I'm out.
Sold.
Wrong
Additional
one.
grottos had been formed, and the yield of yellow metal was exceedingly great,
Right.
so that a mighty and heterogeneous army of miners toiled day and night in the numerous passages and rock hollows. The superintendent, Mr. Arthur, often discussed.
Yeah, y'all get the idea. He's a very wrong one. What did I do? Did I do something wrong? Very wrong? Lovely. My job here is just to make everyone nervous. I'm not actually a person. I'm 3 raccoons in a trench coat. The weird part is nobody has noticed. That's pretty much the show. That's really all I had to show you. I wanted to show y'all Capricious Cabrera. He has a whole handful of these audiobooks over there. I'm serious. Like, why is everybody laughing? I feel like I missed something. Oh, yeah, very wrong one. Okay, I got you. We're not there yet. Okay. You want to move that one up to something useful? Hold up. Where did it go? I think it was this one. And move it up above everything else. Let's see what pops up. Yeah, okay. All right, that's what I wanted to see. We'll do it since everybody absolutely loved that one. Hold up. Damn it, where'd it go? There we go. All right. Now it'll actually work when I press the button. Thank you, Daddy. I appreciate it. All right, folks, I think that pretty well squares everything away. If y'all want to chat backstage, I'm going to drop the link. We're going to give it like 2 minutes of like awkward silence over here, right? Anybody that wants to come in can join in, but I'm not bringing anybody up until after the show's over and I'm off live because we're not taking risks like that anymore. We have no idea what this new dude's going to do with his interpretation of terms of service. I mean, let's be honest. I'm going to try to get this guy to come in and do a interview. I'd like to take a swing at what is it, Lioness in Exile, or I can't remember what's her. Carrie, why haven't you dropped her channel link yet? We have I guess you'd call it an associate of the channel. I don't know if we could go as far as saying friends. I think we've talked once, maybe twice, but she got her channel nuked from Orbit for some trash. It's just stupid. Yeah, no. All right. So the first two videos were obviously linked. These two have a direct reflection upon each other as to how the women versus the men played out. Remember, the Tahitians killed all the men, all but a handful, all but the ones that didn't sleep in their bed that night. Cool. Emails are sent. Communications taking place. Lioness exiled. It's kind of a sexy name if you think about it. I'm not trying to be one of those creeps. I'm just saying, Lioness exiled. Ooh, sexiled. Yeah. Sexiled. Okay, so what do we do about the banking crisis? Anybody got any ideas on that one? Because frankly, the only thing I can think of is to shift assets into active portfolios, because you can guarantee that the companies themselves are going to attempt to maintain their assets as well as possible. Whether or not it's possible is a debatable point. Like I said, I'm going to drop this here link over here. Y'all can come in. We can have us a chat right after all of this is done. Then I'm going to go. I'm probably going to drink some. I might try to play some Minecraft. I don't know. We may do a show. Maybe some Freakazoid. Torch them all. Get your ass in backstage. I'll be with you in a minute. So back when I first started my channel and I first started my show and I first started this whole presentation format thing, I had this outro that I did, and it's actually fairly impressive for what it is, because I only ever intended to use it a couple of times, but it was such a hit that I actually used it for about 6 months. And then directly it occurred to me that when I post the link in chat, it can take people a few minutes to get through getting into backstage and whatnot. And so I ended up making a longer outro to take the place of the short one that I had. And while the short one was really super cool, the longer one just gave more time for everything to go. And the excerpt is from a copyrighted tune, so you can only use a little bit of it and get away with it, right? So yeah, I generally avoid using it for that very reason. But if I'm never planning on being monetized, I don't understand why I hold myself to these standards, right? It doesn't make a lick of sense. I'll be with you in just a second, honey. Yeah. The earthquakes are really intriguing to me, because these earthquakes are one of the theoretic creation theories, I guess, for the Carolina Bays. But the Carolina Bays are almost obviously impact craters. And so when you go look at them, it's like, that wasn't caused by no earthquake. Didn't no wave action or wind action do that shit neither. Something fell out of the sky and then melted. That is the only logical way those things are created the way they are. I wonder how long that thing is. Let's see. Skadoosh, skadoosh, skadoosh. It doesn't tell me. It doesn't tell me at all. I haven't used that freaking outro in so long. I don't even remember how long it is. She runned away from me, y'all. She doesn't love us no more. I'm just trying to give enough time for people to click it before they stick it. You know how it works. I think it's about time for Texas cheesesteak, y'all. Getting kind of hungry, rumbly in the tumbly area. Carrie, I don't trust you in a padded fucking room. I mean, you chit on yourself and fuck it up somehow. I don't know, dude. You convinced me not to trust you in public. Just like I don't drink in public. I'm not sure I'd trust you in public. Right. No, you have rabies. I totally understand. All right. So that's where I'm going to call it. Let's see. Where's the buttons that I need to hit?
Fuck this shit, I'm out. Fuck this shit, I'm out. No thanks. Don't mind me. I'ma just grab my stuff and leave. Excuse me, please. Fuck this shit, I'm out. Nope. Fuck this shit, I'm out. All